So hello everyone and welcome to CTM Festival's Discourse program. My name is Anita Yuri. I'm also one of the curators of the Discourse program and I'm going to host this afternoon. And the topic or the theme of the festival this year is contact. Contact with diverse sonic worlds, communities and experiences, but also between traditions, temporalities and geographies. So when we invited those different speakers who you will also hear today and in the following days, we really wanted to look at this topic and theme from very different angles. So today, for example, you're going to hear a lot of different angles and perspectives on the contact with the modern human world. But in the following days, for example, there will be different topics and speakers about music and sociality and how to recognize and reorganize sociality at all, and the local and the global impacts of the pandemic. So stay with us in the next days. So for this afternoon specifically, we have three main questions we would like to also answer. How do we make contact with our environments and how we might do so in more compassionate, caring ways? What modes of listening are relevant and urgent in our present moment? And how can we negotiate our own position in relation to other more than human entities? So first, in conversation with researcher and electroacoustic composer Jono Gilmurray, sound artist and researcher Amer Kanngieser, and anthropologist Zoe Todd will give insights into modes of listening, especially to fish. Then Jono will also give an own lecture focused on ecology and environmentalism in contemporary music and sound art. Then sound artist, researcher, and deep listening certified tutor Simona Alarcon will invite you to listen to and reflect on her research for sonic and search for sonic migrations. Finally, artist researcher Susan Shupley will introduce her project, Listening to Eyes. So this is the program for this afternoon. You also have to know this is a hybrid event, so I'm also happy that some of you also made it to Bethany and to Berlin-Kreuzberg this afternoon, but also there are some of you who are watching and listening to us also online. And I'd like to encourage all of you, also those of you who are here in the studio and those of you who are joining us online, to be active part of this conversation, because this is why we are here. So whenever you have a question, you can also raise your hand, specifically after the presentations. And also those of you who are joining us online, please feel free to type your question into the YouTube chat, or also you can do it also on Discord. So be active part of those conversations we are going to have this afternoon. So now I'm going to introduce the first speakers of the afternoon, and I will start with Jono Gilmurray, who is here, made it from the UK to Berlin this afternoon, and who is also going to be one of the co-moderators of this afternoon. So you will see that there will be a couple of other times when he's coming and jumping up on the stage too on my side. So Jono is an artist, writer, and lecturer whose work revolves around sound listening and sound art in the era of ecological crisis. He holds a doctorate in sound arts from the University of the Arts London and is a deputy course leader and senior lecturer in music production and at the British and Irish Modern Music Institute in Bristol. He has had journal articles published in Organized Sound and Musicological Annual, for example, and contributed chapters to the book Environmental Sound Arts in Their Own Worlds in 2016 and the Bloomsbury Handbook of Sonic Methodologies in 2020. He's currently writing a book on ecological sound art and sonic eco-criticism, and Jono will also present his paper later this afternoon, Ecological Sound Art, Sound Listening and Environmental Crisis. But before that, now he's going to be in conversation with Amer Kanngieser and Zoe Todd, and I'm also going to introduce them. They are already with us also online, so you will see that Jono is here in the studio and Amer and Zoe are joining us also online to the conversation. So Amer is a geographer and sound artist working with listening to think more closely with or within the entanglements of people, time, and ecologies. Their current project amplifies movements for self-determination in relation to ongoing colonization through resource extraction, environmental racism, and ecological disaster. They are also the author of Experimental Politics and the Making of Worlds, published in 2013, and the forthcoming book Between Sound and Silence, Listening Toward Environmental Justice. Their audio work has been also featured on Document 14 Radio, BBC 3, ABC Radio National, and Deutschland Radio, amongst others. Zoe Todd is a Métis scholar and artist who teaches at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. Zoe's work engages science, art, social sciences, and Indigenous knowledge to tackle the diverse, interconnected challenges of protecting fish. Through her work in Indigenous environmental studies, she focuses explicitly on applying metaphilosophy, art, and law to reassert reciprocal relations with fish, water, and aquatic species. She's a member of the Fluid Boundaries team at Carleton and founder of the Institute for Freshwater Fish Futures, and she's also a member of the Royal Society of Canada's College of New Scholars. So, as mentioned, Amer and Zoe are joining us now online, and I will also pass it to Jonah, who is going to moderate this nice conversation. The title of the conversation is Listening for Connection and Disconnection in Ecosonic Practice. So, Jonah, Amer, Zoe, the stage is yours.
Great, thank you very much, Anita, and welcome, Amer and Zoe. I'm very excited to hear more about your project. Sounds absolutely fascinating. Can I ask you to start by telling us what the sort of origins were of this collaborative project?
Sure. Firstly, thank you so much to Anita and to everybody for inviting us. I'd just like to say where I am right now. I'm on the unceded lands of the Boonwurrung and Wurundjeri people of the East Kulin Nations in so-called Melbourne, Australia. So the work that Zoe and I came together to do really kind of arose out of a shared concern, and I suppose a shared ethic and a disposition towards working with fish and with environments, different kinds of environments. So I have been working for the past 5 or 6 years now across the Pacific with different communities in the Pacific, looking at the ongoing impacts of colonization and the ways that those impacts are exacerbated by climate change. And I've been working in part with fishing communities, so fishing for subsistence and working a lot with reef fish populations in marine protected areas and various kinds of movements for marine protected zones and things like that. And Zoe's interest, as she will speak a little bit in a moment about the Institute for Freshwater Fish Futures, Zoe has been working for a long time on freshwater fish. And we initially came together around this shared interest in how to approach working with fish, both saltwater fish and freshwater fish and fish in between that are both saltwater and freshwater, live in both saltwater and freshwater areas. And so, really, one of the things that drew us together were conversations around communicating and building relationalities to fish. And I think I can't remember when it exactly was, but I can remember sending Zoe some recordings of reef fish and playing her the sounds of reef fish. And I think that was a really kind of pivotal moment in our collaborations, was actually listening to reef fish and the sounds of reef fish, the dawns and dusk choruses of reef fish, and thinking about how to incorporate or how to kind of build in ethnographic sound methods into doing research around fish. And I think what's really important, and what we're going to keep emphasizing today in our conversation, what's really important in the way that we work and the shared ways that we work, particularly as we both come from social science backgrounds and are artistic practitioners as well, so we're both interdisciplinary social scientists and artists, is a very strong focus on relationality and interdependence. So not kind of coming at questions around how to work with ecologies and environments from this point of detachment or from a point of, separation, but really saying, like, how do we work with the communities that are involved in these environments, the communities that are integral to the sustenance of these environments, and in no way trying to take environments away from people, which is a very common practice in conservation and ecological research and scholarship. So building relationships with the people that we work with and with the ecosystems that we work with is incredibly crucial for all of the artistic practice that we do. And we also have a very strong shared commitment to ongoing relations with people. So the projects that we've been working on have been going for years, and especially with establishing the institute, which brings in a number of different scholars and artists that are working around freshwater fish, and maybe at some point as well saltwater fish, but with different fish species. I see you laughing there, Zoe. With different fish species and different watersheds and things like that in a really long-term ongoing basis. But I think Zoe can probably speak more extensively to the Institute and the work that we're doing and the projects that have already been taking place.
Thank you, Jono. Thank you, Anita, and thank you, Amer, and thank you to everyone who's helped bring this hybrid event together. I'm just going to quickly introduce myself and the territory I'm speaking from. So Tanse, Zoinatigasun, Nia Orapem Suesqueo, Eguamaga, Snanaas, Qualakam, Niwigan, Ginanaskomitino Wow, Marci Kakao, Niwako Makinak. So I'm speaking to you from unceded Snanaas and Qualakam First Nations territories here on Vancouver Island on the western coast of so-called British Columbia. And I'm really grateful to be here. And there may be sound leak of the dawn bird chorus through the walls of my very small cottage. Yes, and I can add briefly to what Amer has already explained about our collaboration. I initially trained in biological sciences and then in sociology and anthropology. And through my collaborative work with community members who are working and have been working for lifetimes to protect fish within their communities through Indigenous sovereignty and Indigenous law, it became really clear to me that neither the sciences nor the social sciences in the Western Academy had the capacity to fully understand and honor the embodied and rooted and place connected ways that Indigenous peoples in Canada are enacting our laws collectively across many, many different nations and societies. And so when I met Amer and their work, they started to sort of share their work with me. I was really excited, and it kind of, I realized I hadn't thought about sound in the work that I was doing, but I was actually raised by a radio broadcast journalist, and so sound has been an implicit part of my life. My earliest memories are of going to the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation offices in Edmonton, where my mom was working, and going into like the control room as a toddler, and just kind of sound and communication through sound have just been this part of my life my whole time, and I couldn't believe that I hadn't considered this as an aspect of how to think through those relationships. So collectively with our colleagues and community leaders that we are really lucky to work with, we've established in 2018 the Institute for Freshwater Fish Futures. Its nominal goal is to try and address ways to understand and work with fish that honor diverse non-Western ways of knowing or legal orders or ontologies, whatever sort of English word we use to describe it. It's really about acknowledging that many, many, many different diverse communities and societies of people around Earth have co-created and co-constituted themselves or ourselves with fish, and colonial capitalist, white supremacist, imperial extractive ways of ordering the world over the last few hundred years have effectively severed those relations in a lot of ways. And I'm really inspired by the work of Dr. Leroy Littlebear, who is a Kainai Blackfoot scholar and philosopher here in Canada from Alberta. And he reminds us that the fish have been around for 500,000 years, and that they survived, longer than the Neanderthals, longer than the dinosaurs. I'm paraphrasing him. And he urges us to ask the fish what scientific formula they've discovered in order to survive all of these cataclysms that have wiped out other beings on the planet. And so our team really takes that instruction to heart. And so we're really structured around trying to understand the scientific formula that fish have, discovered over 510 million years. And a lot of their scientific formula has to do with listening, ways that their bodies are structured to listen and attune to their environments. And we find these very instructive for us to learn how to dismantle colonial capitalist ways of being in the world.
Amazing. Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. Thank you. Um, yeah, that's great. I mean, it sounds like sort of inherent to your conception of listening is a being open to learning. And I also notice you're talking about listening on the one side to the fish themselves, and on the other side, the listening to the indigenous peoples um, whose perspectives and wisdom have maybe not been taken into account as they should. Um, can I ask you what you think it is about sound as a medium and listening as a mode of engagement that is perhaps particularly instructive or particularly potent as a means for engaging with the ecological, with the more than human, or with the sort of ecological issues that we face?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I'm not actually, I don't actually think that there is anything particularly unique about sound in attending to environments or ecologies. You know, I don't think that there are any kind of innate properties to sound necessarily. And I really struggle also to think about sound as something that is, you know, a very oral kind of experience that can in some way be separated from other sensorial experiences of the world and other yeah, like other embodied experiences of the world. So, you know, I don't, for me personally, I could say that I think that there is anything particularly inherently superior or special about sound as a way of engaging with the world, or engaging with the more than human. And I think, you know, I mean, I think that there has been a real kind of a really sort of explosive interest, particularly within sound studies and with sound arts, around this idea of the more than human. And um, I often also wonder what we kind of mean as artists when we invoke the more human and we invoke environments and sound together in these kinds of ways. Like I think that there's a lot that kind of needs to be discussed there, because I think one of the key things that Zoe also brought up, which I think is a very important conversation that needs to be had, is the way that particularly very Anglo-European and Eurocentric conceptions of nature, of humans, of the more than human world, and also very much of what constitutes sound from noise. You know, what constitutes a listening subject? Who is the subject that listens? What is the nature that we listen to? All of these ideas are extremely problematic and violent ideas that come from very, very long histories of Eurocentrism and Anglo European onto epistemologies that have been inherently violent and really kind of painted Indigenous people and Black people as disposable, and that have very much elevated white ways of understanding the human and of understanding nature. And so I think, like, in this question, it's a very, very interesting question, because there are a lot of things I think with ecosonic art, and particularly with the kind of desire, I think, of a lot of ecosonic artists to intervene in conversations around climate change and around environmental destruction, to think about, like, what are all of these concepts that we're trying to work with, and what are these ideas that we're trying to draw upon, and what is this nature, or what is this more than human that we're trying to access in some way? Is this another example of Eurocentric anthropomorphism? Is this another way of kind of elevating a particular kind of body and separating our bodies from those bodies? And again, removing that interdependence. But I think Zoe and I talk about this sort of stuff a lot. And I think that, yeah, like we were talking about this before with these ideas of the more than human, Zoe. So I might pass it over to you for a moment.
Oh, sure. And I think, I mean, it's a really interesting question, and it's been very interesting to see ecological sound and the more than human gain traction. I studied at the University of Aberdeen, where Tim Ingold was the head of the anthropology program when I was doing my PhD over a decade ago now. And it was interesting to sort of encounter this interest in European spaces in these relationships. But I think the kind of required to do integral and ethical ecological, a kind of sound and a kind of listening that displaces the ego of the Western researcher, and becomes about how you are attending to time, space, and relations in the moment. And so when we talk about listening within our work, I really feel, for me, it's almost a shorthand for feeling. And the academy, the Western Academy, has been so focused on the visual and noticing in ways that can detach the observer from their environment. What I like about listening and how I use teaching in anthropology and sociology courses at Carleton is it's one way that I can help students start to actually trust what they're feeling in their environment. And I find that when I do these listening exercises with them, um, they start to say like, oh, I hadn't thought of that as like actual knowledge that I could claim that I'm actually experiencing and sharing with the world. And so for me, what I really felt as an Indigenous person with both Indigenous and European settler colonizer ancestors studying in the UK was I really felt the split between knowing and feeling, which goes back to the Enlightenment. And what I like about the way that Amer has sort of articulated listening in the work that we do, have guided us into these relationships, is one that um, really doesn't allow us to do listening without also ensuring that we're feeling and we're feeling our environment. And that's again one of these things that fish are exquisite at, is they listen both with their otoliths, their ear bones, but they also have something called the lateral line, and that allows them to detect changes, like very minute changes in pressure in the water around them. And it's also the scientific formula they've discovered that allows them to do things like school and move as a school when they're being chased by a predator, and they're interpreting information from all around them at all times. So there's a lot more I could say about that, but I think that Anna Singh talks about the arts of noticing, and concepts like that are kind of to from a lot of diverse Indigenous perspectives, like noticing is how you survive, because you're noticing your environment at all times and you're paying attention to it. And you're not just paying attention to it as a thing out there, but it's something that is co-created between humans and more than human beings. And just a note on the idea of like the more than human, from diverse Indigenous perspectives in so-called Canada, a lot of different origin stories that different nations hold is that humans came last. Humans are the least capable. They came, whichever being created them. Often the stories that are carried around how we as humans came to be was that we were the last to show up. We had the least knowledge. We were kind of useless. And so all these other beings and creatures agreed a little, you could say maybe at times begrudgingly, but they agreed to look after us. And so when I am using the more than human, I'm using it in that register that we are in some ways the least capable, the least knowledgeable. And so the more to me signifies that, we are indebted to the sort of capacities of these other beings that have been here for hundreds of millions, if not, long periods of time, incomprehensible to a human brain. There's so much more I could say about that, but I think it's a really good question, and I think that for me, the work I'm trying to do, embedded within the colonial capital of Ottawa as an Indigenous professor, is to really help, especially Anglo European colonizers, understand that sense of feeling and not allowing people to get away with that kind of unfeelingness that was used to enact genocides here. And so listening is one way I bring students into that experience, and it really is transformative in the classroom. I've really seen over the last years how students are starting to pay attention, but also sound is used as a weapon in the colonial state. And I have a brilliant student who's working on a project on this right now, and looking at the ways that racialized communities experienced sound assaults recently in the anti-vax convoy that took over Ottawa for several weeks in January and February 2022, and just the right to listen to your environment, to hear the birds, things like that. Her name is Felicity Howard. She's brilliant, and so I'm going to end there. But these questions are really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. That's really fascinating, really insightful. I'd like to sort of move on to that sort of distinction between sound and listening, because we sometimes sort of say the two words together as if they're one thing, sound and listening. And it feels to me like your work is obviously, as you've said, very much more focused on listening than sounding, and that maybe stands in contrast to a lot of work in sound arts, where it's the artist is creating sound, or they're expressing themselves through sound, or they're saying something through the sound that they make. Whereas it feels like your work is very much about listening more than sounding. So, do you think that is an important distinction to make, and do you feel that more importance should be placed on listening as opposed to sounding within sound arts and sonic research?
I think it's also, again, a really interesting question, because I've been a practicing sound artist and geographer, practicing sound artist for 2 decades now. And I would say that, at least half of the work that I do is actually making sound artworks and doing sound design and putting together like sound installations. And so I think, this kind of idea of of making sound and composing sound and working with sound. And I mean, I am also a field recordist and work extensively with field recordings, and have developed an entire practice which is actually very much incorporated into the institute around consent and permission, with field recordings, and seeking consent and permission from land and from place, as well as from people, because a lot of the work that I do is as a sonic ethnographer, working with different communities, with different Indigenous communities in the Pacific. And I think as time goes on, for me, actually, that distinction between sound and listening actually becomes a lot smaller, because the questions of ethics, the questions of positionality, the questions of who I am that is listening and who I am that is taking sound. How am I taking sound? Do I have permission to take sound? How am I using sound? What places do I invoke with what sounds I use? For the kind of work that Zoe and I are doing, these are all really, really crucial questions. And, I was thinking recently about acousmatic sound, and particularly acousmatic sound used in ecosonic art, and even these kinds of claims to, you know, um, ubiquitous sounds, and sounds that are kind of unattached to definition and meaning, that are felt for their particular aesthetic resonances. And I think, not to be too much of a social scientist about this, but I think that, again, it's so easy to forget that sound and music, like Zoe pointed out as well, with sound warfare and noise, like what gets categorized as sound, what gets categorized as music, what gets categorized as noise, like all of these things have got a very long history within acoustic ecology, and within composition, within musicology. All of these things are very specific aesthetic decisions that get made, that have very concrete implications for communities and for urban geographies and for non-urban geographies. Like, these are not kind of arbitrary categories or distinctions that get made here. These all have very material consequences. And so I think a lot about, like, sound means so many different things, dependent on culture, dependent on context, dependent on the environment that it's taking place in. And maybe for me, a question would be more not, does there need to be more emphasis placed on listening? Again, for me, with sound and listening, the same questions apply. Who is making the sound? Where is the sound coming from? Who is listening? What assumptions are being made about how listeners will receive things? What even determines how we understand what constitutes a listening body? All of these kinds of questions, I think, are questions that we need to come back to and really think about deeply, about where these categories came from and how they've been established, and how we perpetuate them, oftentimes unknowingly or unconsciously, without real kind of consideration. And also what that means when we then move as sound artists within these spaces of making ecological art and, environmental interventions, and particularly commentary about ecosystems, and environmental destruction. What stories are we telling through the sounds that we're collecting and the ways that we are interpreting those sounds? What stories are we making about the world? And I think that this is a really, really important point, is that when we make art that seeks to intervene in systems of racism, of environmental racism, of resource extraction, of colonialism, and like rampant extractive capitalism, when we're looking at these extremely violent and dispossessive systems, and we are going to make art about these systems, we have to be very aware of how we are reiterating and reperpetuating those systems in the very ways that we approach the world. And I think that's something that I really want to stress, because that's something that we're really grappling with in the work that we're doing with fish, is how to approach the world through sound and listening in ways that might disrupt or abolish and disassemble these particular colonial ways of making and hearing the world and communicating the world. So I think, for me, with this question, again, we need to go deeper into what constitutes sound, again, deeper into what constitutes and to be very clear what our stakes are and what our positionalities are, and what stories we're telling and what we're reiterating with the work that we make, even if we don't mean to.
I think from a perspective as an Indigenous researcher artist, I'm not trained in sound art. I'm not trained in sound studies. I'm coming at this from a very different, probably, skill set than many of the people watching. Um, but what I have learned about sound is to really think about who's generating it, and that sound, essentially is waves. It is information coming from the environment somehow. And so Dr. Leroy Little Bear, working from a Kainai perspective, he did an interview 14 years ago now, where he was interviewed by Don Hill, who's a journalist in Alberta. And he was explaining to Don Hill how a particular sacred space in Kainai territory and Blackfoot territory, Writing on Stone Provincial Park, how it operates as this energetic space. And I think sound is sort of like at the limits of, I think, how Western society can kind of understand energy waves, but a lot of non-Western epistemologies and ontologies and cosmologies have ways of understanding, information that comes at us, that is interpreted in complex ways by the body. And I think we're getting to a place where now Western science is saying, oh yeah, trees talk to one another. Oh yeah, fish make intentional sounds. I think a lot of non-Western peoples would say, yeah, of course. We've been noticing this for a long time. In fact, it's how we organize ourselves in relation to place. And so in this article, Don Hill, I'll pull out this quote from Don Hill explaining how Leroy Little Bear was describing how to listen in that place. And so, quote, he tells me to think of the human brain as a station on the radio dial, parked in one spot. It is deaf to all the other stations, he says, the animals, rocks, trees, simultaneously broadcasting across the whole spectrum of sentience, end quote. And what I like about that is that you can't separate sound from listening in that work, because it's always sort of a back and forth between who is generating the sound and who is listening. And I like the idea of it being a bit more of a reciprocal engagement, because if you've ever hunted or fished or trapped, you know that the animals and the beings out in the environment are also listening to you, and they're paying very close attention to you. And so it's a reciprocal engagement. It's a way of communicating in the world. I guess in a Western sense, we could think of sound as the information, and listening is how we engage with that information, and what we do with it is also what matters. And so I don't have a training in sound studies. I may not be using the terminology that is familiar to those in the field, but for me, sound and listening, to me, they coexist. They're co-created. They can't exist without one another. And I just worry that a lot of Western practitioners maybe don't understand that when we're listening to the dawn chorus, whether it's birds or fish, like, they're communicating information to one another. And I always feel a little bit like, when we do our research projects, we always follow the ceremonies of the particular nation we're working with. And we're currently doing a project on a species at risk in Alberta called bull trout. And we're working with the Stoney Nakoda Nation. And before we even sought ethics approval from the university, we had to seek ethics approval through ceremony from the community. And that involved asking permission of the fish to do work in relation to them and with them. And I think that's just so different from how I was trained in scientific research and ethics, where we would worry about covering our legal concerns through the university first and wouldn't even consider asking the fish permission. And there's very stringent protocols that were put in place for us, including that we couldn't do things that would harm the fish, which is second nature to anyone who's working from an Indigenous perspective on fish, but is somehow radical in the Western Academy still. Like we don't use electrofishing. We try not to interfere with the fish in any way. We try to find ways to understand what they're doing without being invasive, and that's because we respect them as more than human beings who have political agency and are listening to us. And so just, I guess, one last thing is when I was working with Inuvialo at Knowledge Keepers in the Northwest Territories in my PhD, this is like a common phenomenon across a lot of different societies in Canada. But one of the things you don't do when you're fishing is you don't brag about how you're going to catch a whole bunch of fish, because the fish can hear you and they will deliberately make sure that you get skunked, that you can't catch any fish. And it's really important to honor those ethics, because the environment is always listening to us. It's always paying attention to us. And one of the conceits of Western colonial capitalist society has been that, that we're the only listening beings out there, and that in fact, and to forget to listen to those relationships. So I think for me, they occur together, and that we're always in these listening sort of relationships at all times. And if anyone's had a child, they listen to everything. Not that I'm comparing animals to children, not going down that road, but just like that. Sometimes we forget how closely people are paying attention to us, and sometimes you might swear or say something that careless that you thought your kids didn't hear, and then you're out in public and they drop an F-bomb, and you realize like, oh, everyone around me is always paying attention, and that's a condition of being a human in the world. And I hope that we can kind of bring that awareness back to our engagements with all of our relations within our worlds. I don't know if that helped, but
That's great. Yeah, thank you so much, both of you. That's brilliant. I think it might be time to open this to questions from the audience, either the audience in the room or the online audience. Anita, how long do we have for this session? Yeah. Okay. So yes, does anybody have any questions for Amer and Zoe? Not yet? No? Okay. Yeah. Yeah, great. We can carry on talking then. That's great. Lovely. Okay. So I found it sort of particularly fascinating, I suppose, the way that your work and your practice and your collaboration is so inherently focused on notions of ethics, and of really thinking about who you are and where you're coming from, and also what you and what anybody really is bringing to listening. It's of course an old saying that the eye sees what it brings to seeing, and of course the same is true of listening. So yeah, I wonder if you could perhaps speak a little bit more about the ethical dimension of your work, because it feels like the ethics with that very sort of conscious focus on what you're bringing to listening is almost the center of your work, almost more than any other aspect. Yeah, so could you speak a little bit more about that ethical dimension of your practice?
Yeah, I mean, I think it forms, I think, as we've kind of said, like relationality and maintaining good relations and being in relation with the people and the places that we work, I think is at the very center of what we do. And a part of that is absolutely, attending very carefully to issues around consent and permission. And, I wrote a piece a little while ago on listening as taking leave, and how to leave a place gracefully, and to give thanks and leave when you're not wanted somewhere. And for me personally, I really started thinking about this work as a white Australian German researcher working in the Pacific, in an area that had been completely oversaturated by white foreign researchers coming in to talk to people about their trauma stories of climate change. And this is something that is very common across a lot of Indigenous communities, is white researchers coming in to extract knowledge, extract Indigenous knowledge, extract people's stories, leave, and then profiteer off that. And so for me, a big question and an initial conversation that I had with all of the people that I worked with was exactly around this. What does it mean to come into this environment? What does it mean to be invited, but also what does it mean to come in uninvited, and to take things? And I really have thought a lot as well about practices of recording as capture and as theft, these taking of sounds. And again, this really goes back into a history of field recording and a history of acoustic ecology and anthropological sound, where researchers and recordists would record Indigenous songs and Indigenous voices and use them as methods of knowledge production, and capture these things and capture these recordings, and then the ways that they're put into museums, used as artifacts. Like, there are long histories here where the contemporary practices, we might not think so much about these histories anymore, but these are the histories that these contemporary practices are embedded within. This is how we come to do contemporary field recording. And so I think these questions around ethics and positionality and consent are very necessary to ask. And Zoe and I write about this extensively, and are writing about this even more. Like, this is a very strong focus of our work, is how to actually get back to those questions and to think, who am I that's in this scenario? But I mean, one of the things that I really found through the work that I do was that the more that I kind of worked with, or the more that I had conversations with people in the Pacific, particularly in Kiribati and Fiji, the Marshall Islands, with people about listening and about listening to environments, the more that I started to understand and really tune into the fact that it wasn't enough to just get consent from communities or to get consent from the government. It was important to constantly also be attuning and seeking consent from the places that I was recording. And yeah, I have a whole range of stories about what started to happen when I wasn't getting consent, about equipment failure and all these sorts of things. But it just became very clear to me that it felt very different if there had been those processes of invitation and permission, from communities and from environments, than to go in and to just take a recording of somewhere. So yeah, I think that kind of focus of relationality and that focus of building, very, very key to what we do.
And I think an example for me of this enacted in film is my aunt Loretta Todd, who's a Cree Métis filmmaker. And she recently adapted Haisla and Heiltsuk writer Eden Robinson's best-selling novel Monkey Beach into a feature film in Canada. It took her 15 years to get it from optioning it and getting permission from Eden to turn it into a film, until it was actually released to the public in the fall of 2020. And in watching that film, what was so clear was that those 15 years of labor that my aunt, as a Cree Métis person who was not from Eden's nation, put into getting the appropriate permission from the community. And also, when you watch the film, you can see that she really labored to make sure that she had the appropriate permissions from the land as well, as guided by Haisla and Heiltsuk people within Kitimat, the community where it was filmed. And when you watch the film, you can see it, and people have told me, like, I watched your aunt's film, and what's really clear is just the spirit of the film is different from it than if a white Euro Canadian had adapted that book, because you can just really feel a difference in it. And I think that that's one of the lessons I try to teach my students, whether non-Indigenous or Indigenous, is this kind of work takes the time it needs to take. You're not going to make a documentary on this issue in one field season and get it to the BBC or whatever and have done that in the appropriately ethical way. Like, this takes time to make the relationships, to get the appropriate permissions, to follow the explicit, distinct protocols of the nations that you're working with. And it takes time. And the Western Academy is just not, and I think also the Western art world really struggle with that kind of long, tender, graceful, humble kind of work to get the appropriate permissions, both from human and more than human co-constituents of a place, time. And so working within capitalist systems, it's really hard to do that, because taking 15 years to do something properly, it's really hard to sell that, I think. I can't speak for my aunt at all. I would not want to, but I can say as a researcher, the kind of work that I'm trying to do, it doesn't lend itself well to like the REF process. I would fail, I think, in the UK, trying to sort of show what the impact of my work has been, because I am only 39 and I'm just starting, I think, to actually do work that is appropriately grounded in the way it needs to be. And our institute, is 4 years old, and I think it's just starting to actually embody the kind of relationality that it needs to. And so, yeah, it's hard. It's really hard. But I guess all I can encourage is that we just keep leaning into that collectively across the different spaces and understand that things take the time they need to take, and that they take relationships. All relationships take work. Like, it's just like this basic fact of being human in the world, is that making sure that we have everything that we need for one another, and that we're negotiating those things. You can't do it in the timeline set by university research sort of cycles and things like that, and grant cycles and award cycles. And so it's hard work, and not everyone has funding and the support to do it properly either. And that's one of the great tragedies, is that a lot of are working in precarious positions where they be fully supported to do. And so
And that was the first question from Samira.
Cool. So did you guys get that? That's what does it mean for you both to be collaborating across continents?
Thank you so much.
It means
for
a
that
lot of
question,
time.
Samira.
Sorry. I think it means a lot of talking at Amer's morning and my nighttime, or vice versa. Yeah, that's sort of a short answer, but yeah, go ahead, Amer.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we wrote about in a recent paper was about, both of us have a very extensive field-based practice. Both of us have very long-standing ethnographic practices, and obviously with COVID and with the kinds of constraints, constraints on health, constraints on mobility, constraints on finances, all these kinds of things, it completely changes the nature of how to conduct the work that we do. And so we've spent a lot of time over the past couple of years thinking, and thinking with our collaborators, my collaborators in the Pacific in Fiji, and Zoe's collaborators as well, thinking about to continue very in-placed collaborations through different kinds of ways of communicating, different kinds of formats, connection, and things like that. So yeah, it's really it's really a kind of ongoing process of thinking how to do very placed and very specific kind of work when you're not able to access those places or people, and how to continue on communicating and collaborating with communities and collaborating with one another when we can't be together, when we can't actually share that physical space. And so, I mean, I think I think for us also a really lovely thing is always we'll record sounds for each other and send each other sounds, and really at the core, again, at the core of all of this is friendship. It's love, it's care, it's the people that we spend time with and the people that we care about. This is not a work relationship. This is we have relationships that will be for the rest of our lives. And as Zoe said, this is not, it's not just a project and then it's over. This is something that we will continue to work on for a very, very long time. And these collaborations, for me as well, I feel like are still just in their beginnings. I feel like there's still so much for us to like learn and negotiate and figure out. And it's this continual ongoing process. And so I think, yeah, taking that perspective of understanding that this is not a kind of, it's not an arbitrary fleeting connection. It's a lifelong ongoing relationship, and ongoing relationships that require continual work and commitment and responsibility as well.
Great, thank you very much. Anita, do you want to?
Yeah, there are a couple of more questions. So it seems like that now the online community is really active. So Shioban asks, could you perhaps offer some advice on how to be a better listener? Are there any approaches or methods you follow?
I could jump in and sort of offer some that Amer
Go,
has taught
Zoe.
me. So Amer has really helped me come into more sort of like somatic listening and thinking of listening as a practice. And so not that I do it every day, but when I sort of remember to do it, I try to just stop and spend a bit of time listening to my environment every day. And of course it accords with all sorts of like mindfulness practices that have gained a little bit more sort of public kind of awareness, but have been part of many, many different societies' practices for millennia. And so that kind of listening in a way that connects to your body has been really transformative for me. And it also has made me a better relative, because I find that I'm actually listening to the people around me. And my sister's, like, she would forgive me for mentioning her, I think. My sister's also been really good at teaching me to listen. She says, like, put your phone down, like listen to what I'm saying. And that kind of gentle but firm reminder to be present with the people in your life, I think is really key, especially right now, as it can be overwhelming to be in the world, and to have safe spaces where you can listen together, or listen. For a lot of my life, I've been listening in a hypervigilant way to find out where the dangers and the risk are as an Indigenous person in Canada. But I feel really blessed and lucky that I can carve out these little tiny spaces where I can be listening for pleasure, or listening to sort of think like, what are the birds trying to communicate today? And that's very different from listening for the danger around me. Not to dismiss that as an important survival skill that I developed, and many people also have to enact. But I just feel really grateful that Amer has helped me kind of maybe heal some of my relationship to listening in such a way that now I can also listen for happy and good reasons, and to be present in a body that has not always felt safe to be present. Yeah.
Great, that's really nice. Thank you very
But this
much.
is, yeah, sorry, I'll also just add to that, because we have also been running listening workshops since last year as well. And that's also something that we're doing through the Institute as well, is doing listening workshops, and a kind of more, I guess, practical public side of the work that we do is offering this sort of thing back to, artistic and academic and public communities, doing listening workshops with people. And that's something that, yeah, we'll be offering more extensively through the Institute over the next year or so.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, Anita, do we have another
Yeah, I think
question?
this
Yes.
could be the last question. And there are two questions which I'm going to read out together because they belong together. So the first one is from Fungus Frau. How exactly do you ask for consent from a sentient non-human being or place? And then Manic Music asks forward on this question. And further, how do you know when consent is not given by a place and the non-human beings there?
This is basically the crux of our research. These are wonderful questions. And again, we probably can't touch on them in the short amount of time left, but I think the first for me, one way that I seek permission is explicitly through guidance of the nation I'm working with, and following the protocols of that nation, who have already laws in place for how to ask permission of a place, and make sure that we're respecting the agency and of the beings. But Amer's work on consent, I think, really speaks to the second question and really learning that. I'm sure we've all had that feeling of walking into a place and just like all the hair standing up on the back of your neck, and just really feeling.
Signal for a few minutes there. Um, so I think we got sort of the first minute, Zoe, of your answer then, and then you both froze. So would you mind going back a bit to answer that last question?
We were just messaging each other. We're like, maybe this, like, the beings that we work with don't want us to tell our secrets.
Yes.
We can't tell you.
Can't tell you. So, yeah, I think maybe we'll just leave it at that. Things like this actually to us communicate consent. Like, whether you adhere to that worldview or not is okay, but we just pay really close attention to sort of when things are working, when they don't, when things feel right in your body, when they don't, which are the same lessons that we try to teach to our, within our families, to our children. I don't have children, but that we're trying to teach people to really trust what your gut is saying. And that's what I really try to teach my students too, is like, trust your gut. When something isn't quite right, when what someone is saying doesn't line up with what they're doing. And I show them the James Baldwin quote from his piece in The Nation in 1966 about anti-Black police state violence against Black communities in Harlem. And at the end of that essay is a line where he says, "I can't believe what you say because I see what you do." And I share that line with my students just to remind them to really pay close attention to what you're feeling in a space, and really to learn what consent feels like to be in a place in that way too. So from an environmental sound recording perspective, we talk about that in our work as really knowing when a place is enthusiastically okay with you being there recording, and also when it's not. And sometimes your equipment fails or things just make it really clear to you that you're not supposed to be there. And so, as Amer says, learning to leave gracefully. So they're slightly different issues that I've just combined there, but just that importance of really, so much of Western society's operation is kind of on sleight of hand and concealing what's really going on. And so what I'm really trying to communicate to students is really learning to look behind the structures and the systems to see what's really going on. And so that's connected to this idea of, if we're going to record things, we have to make sure we really have permission, just to disrupt that way that Western society has operated, of feeling like it has a right to everything, which is not true. I hope that helps, makes sense.
And I would add to that. I would add to that specifically, again, for recordists or for people working with sound. A couple of years back, I wrote 3 pieces on listening as method. So listening as coming to, listening as being with, and listening as taking leave. And the third piece, listening as taking leave, is explicitly about how I know when I am not wanted somewhere. And it explicitly goes into one example. And yeah, I think that's probably as much as I'll say on that, because it kind of has, I have already written about it a little bit. But yeah, there's a lot to be said about this. And this is also in part what we talk about in our listening workshops and in teaching and things like that as well.
Great, thank you both very much. Well, I think we've run out of time, but that was a really fascinating and enlightening conversation. So thank you both so much for doing this, and I hope to talk with you again at another time. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. Good to meet you, and thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And then John will be